Stonefield County, Wisconsin, is the kind of place people forget exists until they need something from it. A death certificate, a land record, a name confirmed or erased. It sits quietly between larger counties, bordered by cornfields and stretches of road where the radio fades in and out, where towns appear without warning and disappear just as quickly. People there like to say nothing ever happens, and for the most part, that's true. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. Just the slow, predictable rhythm of living and dying, handled politely and without fuss. For 32 years, I was the one who handled the dying part. My name doesn't matter as much as my title did. County Coroner, Stonefield County, Wisconsin. An elected position, technically, but one that never changed hands unless someone retired or passed away. Most people didn't know where my office was, only that it existed somewhere behind the courthouse, past the records room and the old evidence lockers that still smelled faintly of dust and paper. I liked it that way. The work required distance, precision, detachment. Bodies are easier to understand when you don't think of them as people. I had rules, procedures, checklists that never varied. I believed deeply in the idea that death followed patterns, that it obeyed laws even when life didn't. If you looked closely enough, long enough, you could always find the answer. Cause, time, sequence. That belief carried me through car accidents, farm equipment failures, quiet overdoses no one talked about, and heart attacks that happened in recliners while television murmured to empty rooms. It carried me until the night a body arrived without a proper explanation. The call came later than usual, well after midnight, when Stonefield County feels hollowed out and thin. The sheriff didn't give details. He rarely did. Just an address near the northern edge of the county, past the old quarry road. No signs of violence, he said. No witnesses. The words he used were routine, but there was a pause before he hung up that lingered longer than it should have. I remember thinking that it was snowing, not heavily, just enough to soften the edges of things. Snow does that. It makes the world feel unfinished, like it's holding its breath. The body arrived alone. That should have been the first thing I questioned. Normally there was paperwork, a deputy lingering by the door, a brief exchange of nods and clipped sentences. This time the transport van pulled away almost immediately. The paperwork was thin, too thin. Name listed, age approximate, time of discovery vague, no medical history, no next of kin, no explanation for why the body had been found where it was. I told myself it was an oversight. Stonefield County ran on oversights. I signed the intake log and wheeled the gurney inside myself. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the body. Middle-aged, male, no visible trauma, no blood, no marks that suggested a struggle or an accident. If anything, he looked peaceful in the way people often do when they're no longer present enough to worry about appearances. His eyes were closed. His hands rested at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as if they had relaxed into that position rather than been placed there. I remember thinking that he looked unfinished, not damaged, not wrong, just incomplete, like a sentence that stops one word too early. That thought unsettled me more than it should have. I chalked it up to fatigue and moved him into cold storage. Standard procedure dictated that I wait until morning to begin the autopsy. But something about the case resisted delay. The paperwork didn't sit right. The lack of context gnawed at me. I told myself I'd only do a preliminary examination. Measurements, photographs, notes to prepare for the full process later. That was the first lie I told myself. In the quiet of the morgue, time behaves differently. Minutes stretch, thoughts echo. You become acutely aware of your own breathing, your own weight in the room. I stood there longer than necessary, looking at the body, waiting for something I couldn't have named then. Some sign, some confirmation that this was, in fact, just another routine case. I had a phrase I used internally whenever a sense of unease crept in. A grounding habit learned early in my career. Not real. Real. Not real. It was my way of reminding myself that fear was a reaction, not a fact. That bodies didn't mean anything beyond what they physically presented. That stories were something the living invented. I repeated the phrase silently as I began my work. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. The refrigeration unit was functioning normally, but the body was colder than expected. Not dramatically so, just enough to register as an anomaly. I adjusted the gauge, waited, checked again, no change. I noted it in the margin of my paperwork and moved on. Measurements came next. Height, weight, limb length. Everything fell within acceptable ranges, but there was an odd inconsistency to the proportions. Not enough to be visible at a glance, but enough that I had to double-check my numbers. The left arm appeared marginally longer than the right. The rib spacing didn't quite match standard anatomical references. I told myself bodies vary. That's why averages exist. Still, I felt the urge to hurry, an impatience that made my hands feel clumsy. I disliked that feeling. I prided myself on calm, on thoroughness. Rushing leads to mistakes. I slowed myself down and took photographs. When I looked back at the body after lowering the camera, something had changed. I couldn't have said what it was at first. The position was the same. The lighting hadn't shifted. And yet, there was a subtle difference. The way there is when you return to a room you know well and immediately sense that something has been moved. I leaned closer, scanning for signs of disturbance. That's when I noticed the mark. It was faint, almost colorless, running along the upper chest near the sternum. A line, thin and shallow, as if something had pressed against the skin rather than cut into it. I was certain it hadn't been there moments before. I would have seen it. I always documented external marks first. I checked the photographs. The earlier images showed no such line. I felt a flicker of irritation then, sharper than fear. I disliked unexplained discrepancies. I took another photograph, adjusted the lighting, and made a note to examine the area more closely during the full autopsy. As I covered the body again and closed the storage drawer, a thought surfaced unbidden, unprofessional, and unwelcome. What if this isn't the first time? Not this body, this moment. What if this was part of something already in progress? I dismissed the thought as nonsense. Everyone who works with death develops strange habits of thinking. You learn to live alongside unanswered questions. That's the job. Still, as I turned off the lights and locked the morgue door behind me, I found myself pausing in the hallway, listening to the quiet of the building, aware of a growing sense that something had been set in motion, not real. Real, not real. I repeated it again, more firmly this time, and went home. I didn't sleep. By morning, the snowfall had thickened, the kind that made Stonefield County look temporarily erased. The courthouse lawn was a smooth white sheet. The road edges had vanished. Even the familiar landmarks, grain silos, fence lines, the dented mailbox at the turnoff, looked softened, altered, as if the world had been wrapped in gauze. I arrived early, not because I was eager, exactly, but because the sleepless hours had stacked up behind my eyes until they felt heavy and hot. And the only thing that made sense was returning to routine, returning to the clean certainty of procedure. In the parking lot, my tires hissed over slush. I sat for a moment with the engine running, hands on the wheel, watching my breath fog the windshield. The building looked the same as it always had, square, municipal, indifferent. Still, I hesitated, as if the act of stepping inside would make something final. Not real. Real, not real. I turned off the engine and went in. The hallways were quiet. They always were. But that morning the silence felt thicker, almost textured. My footsteps made a soft, lonely sound that didn't echo the way it should have. I passed the records office, the evidence lockers, the empty reception desk. Everything appeared normal. It should have eased me. It didn't. My morgue was in the back, separated from the rest of the building by a set of locked doors that kept the public out and kept whatever lived in this part of the county's work hidden from polite conversation. The key turned smoothly. The lock clicked open. I stepped inside and was greeted by the familiar chemical-clean scent of disinfectant layered over cold metal and old tile. I hung up my coat, washed my hands, and prepared my workspace the same way I always did. Gloves, mask, apron, tools laid out in their exact order. Then I opened the cold storage drawer. The body was still there, of course. It would have been absurd for it not to be. But the sense of wrongness returned the instant I looked at him. And this time I knew why. The mark on his chest, the thin, pale line, was gone. I stood there, staring, feeling my mouth go dry. I reached for my clipboard and flipped to the photographs from the night before. The new image I had taken clearly showed the line. Thin as a hair but unmistakable. Proof that I hadn't imagined it. Yet the skin in front of me was smooth and unbroken. I leaned closer, angling the overhead light. No trace. Not even a faint discoloration. My first thought wasn't supernatural. It was practical. I checked the drawer temperature, convinced the refrigeration had failed and condensation had altered the skin in some way that made the mark harder to see. The unit was steady, cold enough to numb my fingertips when I touched the metal rails. I removed the sheet and began documenting again, as if repetition could pin reality in place. I took fresh photographs, measured again, wrote down details. Every time my eyes drifted back to the chest area, I felt a prickling pressure behind my sternum, as if my own body was mirroring the one on the table. The measurements didn't match my notes, not drastically, not enough to be obvious, but enough that my carefully written figures from last night no longer aligned with what the tape measure told me now. I checked my tools. I checked my handwriting. I checked the calibration on the scale. Everything was correct. The body wasn't. I forced myself to proceed. That was the only reasonable response. Panic had no place here. The dead don't change. And if they did, the explanation would be mundane. A transcription error, a faulty measurement, a lapse of memory caused by exhaustion. Still, I found myself looking toward the corner of the room where the old tape recorder sat. It was outdated equipment we kept mostly out of habit. Years ago, I'd used it to dictate reports when my hands were full, before typing became easier. I hadn't touched it in months. Yet that morning, it was sitting slightly forward on the counter, like someone had used it recently. I told myself I must have bumped it. I didn't go near it. Instead, I began the official autopsy. There are parts of the process that have to be described bluntly, even when you're trying to maintain dignity. But there's also a way to talk around them. To focus on the rhythm rather than the imagery. The mechanics rather than the mess. That's what I'll do here. Because what happened wasn't about blood or organs. It was about the sense that I was handling something that didn't belong in my world. The first incision was precise, controlled, familiar. And then it was as if the room listened. That's the only way I can describe it. The air felt attentive, waiting. The overhead fluorescent lights didn't flicker, but their hum seemed to deepen, as if a hand had turned a dial somewhere out of sight. I paused, held still, and listened to my own breathing through the mask. Nothing else moved. Nothing else sounded. Not real. Real. Not real. I continued. As I worked, I noticed small inconsistencies that made no medical sense. The internal structures were present, but not quite arranged the way they should have been. It wasn't grotesque. It wasn't malformed. It was subtle. Like a puzzle assembled by someone who'd studied photographs instead of real pieces. I kept thinking of mannequins, of store displays built to resemble humans from a distance, convincing until you stood close enough to notice that the joints were wrong, the proportions slightly off. But this was a real body. Warm once. Living once, wasn't it? Every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the face. The eyes stayed closed. The expression stayed blank. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being observed. Not from the door, not from any obvious hiding place. From inside the body itself. Halfway through my documentation, I realized something else. The paperwork was different. The file folder I'd set beside my notes now had extra pages inside it. Not new forms I'd added. Not something that could have been there unnoticed. Entire sheets of typed text, clean and official looking, as if they'd always belonged. They were autopsy reports. Not for this body, for others. Old cases. I flipped through them with growing confusion. Dates spanning decades, names I didn't recognize, and yet the language, the phrasing, the structure, it was mine. It read like my writing, my style, my method. Even when the dates predated my employment in Stonefield County by years. Some of the reports were incomplete, ending mid-sentence, stopping abruptly, as if whoever wrote them had been interrupted and never returned. More than once, a phrase repeated near the end of the text. Not real. Real. Not real. My stomach tightened. I set the folder down carefully, like it might bite. For a long moment I just stood there, hands hovering over the table, hearing the low hum of the lights, the distant groan of the building settling under snow weight. Then, from somewhere in the morgue, a sound. Soft, thin, almost delicate. A tapping. It didn't come from the door or the vent. It didn't come from the walls. It came from the cold storage drawers behind me. I turned slowly, heart hammering despite my efforts to stay calm. The tapping came again. 3 light knocks, as if someone inside one of the drawers was testing the surface from within. I stared at the metal fronts. Each one identical, each one sealed shut. Only one was open, the one holding the body on my table. The others were closed. Empty, I was sure. We hadn't had any other cases that week. The logs were clear. Not real. Real, not real. I backed away from the drawers, my heel catching slightly on the edge of a floor drain. I steadied myself, anger flaring in self-defense. This was ridiculous. Buildings make noises, pipes click, metal contracts in cold. But then the tapping shifted. It moved laterally, as if traveling along the line of drawers. Tap, tap, tap. A slow progression. A deliberate search. I held my breath and watched, waiting for it to stop, waiting for logic to reassert itself. It reached the drawer directly beneath the one I'd opened earlier that morning. The drawer that should have been empty. The tapping stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and expectant. And then, with a sound like a sigh through metal, the latch on that drawer clicked. Not a mechanical failure, not a loose hinge, a click, like someone had unlocked it from the inside. I didn't move. Couldn't. The drawer slid out an inch, then another. And that was when I saw the edge of something pale beneath the sheet inside. A foot. Human. Toes exposed, as if the covering had shifted. But there shouldn't have been anything in there. I knew what the log said. I knew what my memory said. I stared at that foot, and a cold understanding began to creep up my spine. The morgue wasn't just holding bodies. It was making them, or calling them back. Not real. Real, not real. I whispered it out loud for the first time, my voice small in the sterile room. The drawer continued to slide open, slowly, smoothly, as if guided by careful hands, and something inside it breathed. A shallow, patient inhale. Not mine. Not the body on the table. Something else. Something that had been waiting for me to come back in. Something that remembered my name, even if I didn't. I took one step backward, and the overhead lights flickered once. Just once. Like a blink. When they steadied again, the drawer was fully open. And it was empty. No sheet, no foot, no body. Just cold metal, gleaming clean, as if it had never been touched. But on the inside of the drawer door, etched faintly into the steel, as if scratched by a fingernail, was a line of text. Not typed, not printed, written. It said, "The county coroner in Stonefield County, Wisconsin, who performed an autopsy that changed." And it stopped there. An unfinished sentence, a title without an ending. I stood frozen, staring at it, and felt something shift in my mind, like a latch loosening. Because I knew, without knowing how, that the ending wasn't missing. It was being withheld. And whatever withheld it was doing so on purpose. Not real. Real. Not real. I turned back toward the body on the table, and the face seemed different. The eyes were still closed, but the mouth had moved, just slightly, as if it had almost formed a word, as if it was learning how to speak again. And behind my own thoughts, behind my own pulse, I felt it. Another presence, settling into place like it had always belonged there. Waiting, listening, ready to finish the sentence. I don't remember leaving the morgue. That's the first gap I can't account for, and it bothers me more than everything that came after. One moment I was standing beside the table, staring at the body's mouth, convinced it had shifted into something almost like intention. The next, I was sitting in my car with the engine running, the courthouse already shrinking in the rearview mirror. Snow pressed in from all sides, swallowing the road markings. My hands were locked around the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached, but I had no memory of gripping it that way. My breath came shallow and quick, fogging the glass. Not real. Real. Not real. I said it aloud again, louder this time, as if volume might make it truer. The drive home passed in fragments. A stop sign I didn't remember slowing for. A stretch of road that felt longer than it should have been. A farmhouse with its lights on at mid-morning, every window glowing, though I couldn't recall anyone living there anymore. When I reached my driveway, I sat there for several minutes before turning off the engine. The house looked unchanged, modest, familiar, a place where nothing waited for me except quiet. Inside, I washed my hands. Once, twice, 3 times. I scrubbed until my skin burned, staring at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face looked the same, but there was something off in my eyes. A slight delay, like my expression took an extra beat to catch up with my thoughts. I didn't go back to work that day. I told myself I was sick. That exhaustion had finally caught up to me. I made coffee I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. Every sound felt amplified. The refrigerator cycling on. The pipes clicking as heat moved through them. The faint wind brushing against the siding. Each noise carried the same question beneath it. Are you listening? By late afternoon, the sun hung low and pale behind the clouds. I stood at the window and watched the snow fall, trying to ground myself in ordinary details, the way the flakes drifted sideways, the way the fence line disappeared inch by inch. That's when I noticed the envelope on the table. It hadn't been there earlier. I was certain of that. No mail had come. I would have remembered opening the door, feeling the cold rush in. The envelope was unmarked, no stamp, no return address, just my name written across the front in neat, careful handwriting. My handwriting. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I picked it up slowly, turning it over in my hands. It felt heavier than it should have, thick with more than just paper. Inside was a single sheet, an autopsy report, my header, my formatting, my signature at the bottom. The date was wrong. It was dated 37 years earlier. I read it once, then again, my heart pounding harder with each line. The report described a body found near the northern edge of Stonefield County. No witnesses, no signs of violence, no clear cause of death. Measurements that didn't quite align, notes about subtle anatomical inconsistencies, my notes, notes I had never written. And yet, as I read them, memories stirred. False memories, maybe, or something worse. Flashes of a younger version of myself standing in the same morgue, wearing the same expression of forced calm, the same creeping doubt. At the end of the report, where the cause of death should have been listed, there was only a sentence fragment. Autopsy inconclusive. Examination incomplete due to... The sentence ended there, cut off sharply. Below it, written in the margin in smaller letters, was the phrase again. Not real. Real. Not real. I dropped the paper as if it had burned me. For the first time since the night before, fear fully took hold. Not the abstract unease I'd felt in the morgue. Not the creeping dread of unanswered questions. This was sharp and personal. This was the realization that whatever I was dealing with knew me. Knew my habits, knew my voice, knew my past. I spent the evening trying to distract myself. Television murmured in the background without meaning. I ate dinner without tasting it. Every so often, I caught myself listening toward the hallway, half expecting to hear footsteps that weren't mine. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it came with dreams. In the dream, I was standing in the morgue again, but it was larger than it should have been. The walls stretched away into shadow. The cold storage drawers lined up endlessly, each one labeled with a name. Every name was mine. I walked past them, reading date after date, lifespan after lifespan, all ending the same way. Incomplete, unfinished, interrupted. At the far end of the room, a single table waited beneath a light. On it lay a body covered by a sheet. I knew without looking that it was me. When I reached for the sheet, a voice spoke from behind me, calm and patient. "You're early this time." I woke with a gasp, my heart racing, the echo of the voice still ringing in my ears. Morning light filtered through the curtains. For a brief moment, relief washed over me. It was just a dream, just stress, just my mind trying to make sense of coincidence and exhaustion. Then I noticed the smell. Disinfectant. Faint, but unmistakable. I sat up slowly, scanning the bedroom. Everything looked normal. The bed, the dresser, the closed door. But the smell persisted, sharp and sterile, utterly out of place. I followed it down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. It led me to my home office, a room I rarely used anymore. When I opened the door, my breath caught. The room had changed. Not dramatically. Not enough to scream impossibility. The desk was the same. The shelves were the same. But the arrangement was different. Papers neatly stacked where there had been clutter. A lamp positioned just so. And on the desk, centered carefully, sat the old tape recorder from the morgue. I hadn't brought it home. I was certain of that. My hands trembled as I approached it. A cassette was already inside, labeled in that same familiar handwriting. Stonefield County. I stared at it for a long time before pressing play. At first there was only the low hiss of recording tape. Then a breath. My breath. "This is a record," my voice said, steady and professional, though I didn't remember speaking the words. "In case the pattern repeats." There was a pause, filled with quiet. If you're listening to this, then you're where I was, or where I am. It's hard to tell which anymore. Another pause. I could hear the faint hum of fluorescent lights in the background. The body isn't the anomaly. The autopsy isn't the cause. We think we're examining something external, something contained. That's the mistake. The tape crackled softly. It's a process, a role. Someone has to perform it. Someone has to open the boundary and keep it from widening. My chest felt tight, each word pressing in on me. I tried to stop. I tried to leave. It didn't let me. A shaky inhale. If you're hearing this, then it's adjusting to you now. Learning you. Mapping you. The tape clicked off. I stood there in silence, my own recorded voice echoing in my head. The implications settled slowly, heavily. This wasn't the first time. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. The county coroner wasn't just a job. It was a position in something older than the courthouse, older than the county lines drawn on maps, a function that needed a human presence to operate. I thought of the body on the table, of the empty drawer, of the unfinished sentence scratched into metal. The title wasn't incomplete because it lacked information. It was incomplete because it needed a name, my name. Somewhere deep inside me, a door I hadn't known existed creaked open. And I understood, with a clarity that made my stomach twist, that going back to the morgue wasn't optional. Something had been started, and I was already part of it. Not real. Real. Not real. I whispered it again, but the words felt thinner now, less convincing, because the truth was settling in. This wasn't haunting me. It was training me, and it expected me to return. I didn't go back to the morgue right away. That fact matters. Because for a long time afterward, I wondered if the delay made things worse, or if it was already too late by the time I understood what was happening. I stayed home for 2 days, calling in sick, avoiding the courthouse, pretending that distance could function as a barrier. It couldn't. The tape recorder stayed on my desk. I tried to put it in a drawer, but each time I turned away, I felt a pull behind my eyes, a pressure that didn't ease until it was back in view. I didn't play the tape again. I didn't need to. The words replayed themselves well enough on their own. It's a process, a role. Someone has to perform it. I spent those 2 days searching for explanations that didn't involve accepting that sentence. I pulled old county records from online archives, newspaper clippings, election histories. I searched the names of previous coroners in Stonefield County, expecting to find some pattern of scandal or illness or coincidence that could anchor all of this in something recognizable. What I found instead was absence. Records were incomplete. Gaps stretched across decades where names should have been. One coroner listed for a single term with no biographical information attached. Another whose tenure ended abruptly with no explanation. The position filled weeks later by someone else. There were no obituaries, no retirement announcements, just quiet replacement. As if the county itself resisted acknowledging continuity. Late on the second night, I found something that made my hands go numb. An article from a small regional paper, nearly 50 years old, buried deep in a digitized archive. The headline was unremarkable, the kind of filler story that rarely gets revisited. Local official steps down following medical leave. The article was brief. It named the coroner, described his years of service, mentioned stress, exhaustion, a desire to spend time with family. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, was a sentence that hadn't been properly scanned, the text slightly warped. He was unavailable for comment at the time of publication. The photograph beside the article showed a man standing in front of the courthouse. It was me. Not exactly me, but close enough that the resemblance made my breath catch. Same posture, same eyes, same faint crease between the brows that came from concentrating too hard on details that didn't want to line up. The date on the article predated my birth. I closed my laptop and sat there in the dark, the room pressing in around me. The walls felt closer than they should have been. My own name echoed in my head, stripped of context, reduced to a placeholder. I slept poorly again, and when morning came, the decision had already been made. I went back. The courthouse doors opened, as they always had. The lobby smelled faintly of old paper and cleaner. The receptionist greeted me by name, her smile polite and unremarkable. Nothing looked wrong. That made it worse. As I walked down the familiar hallways, I felt a subtle resistance, like pushing against a current you can't quite see. Each step required effort. Each breath felt measured. The morgue door was unlocked. I hadn't left it that way. Inside, everything was in its place. The lights hummed softly. The metal surfaces gleamed. The body from before lay where I'd left it, covered neatly, as if no time had passed at all. For a moment, relief threatened to take hold. Maybe this was all stress. Maybe I'd read too much into coincidence and fatigue and half-remembered dreams. Then I noticed the clipboard. It was filled, pages of notes in my handwriting, written in a tight, precise script. Dates, observations, measurements, all current, all accurate. I hadn't written any of it. The notes described procedures I didn't remember performing, tests I couldn't recall running, conclusions that danced around certainty without ever reaching it. At the bottom of the last page was a sentence I didn't recognize. Subject displays adaptive inconsistency. Examination alters parameters. I read it twice, then a third time. Adaptive. As if the body wasn't static, as if it responded. I uncovered the face. The eyes were open. I staggered back, heart hammering, my heels scraping loudly against the tile. The eyes were dull, unfocused, fixed on the ceiling. They didn't track me. They didn't blink, but they hadn't been open before. I knew that, with absolute certainty. I forced myself to approach again, step by careful step. Up close, the face looked unchanged, peaceful even. The mouth was closed now, lips pressed together in a neutral line. Still, the sensation of being watched intensified. I began examining the body again, slower this time, narrating each step out loud like I used to when training new staff. The sound of my own voice anchored me, kept my thoughts from spiraling. As I worked, patterns began to emerge. The inconsistencies weren't random. They followed rules. Measurements drifted, but only within narrow ranges. Internal structures shifted subtly, but always toward symmetry, toward balance. It was as if the body was correcting itself, adjusting in response to observation. Learning. I realized then that every time I examined it, I changed it. Not physically, in the way I understood change, but contextually. By observing, by measuring, by categorizing, I was imposing structure, meaning. And it was responding in kind. A thought crept in, unwelcome and persistent. What if the body wasn't the subject? What if I was? I stepped away from the table and looked around the room, really looked this time. The walls, the drains, the storage drawers. They didn't feel like containment. They felt like interfaces. I thought of the empty drawer, of the breathing that hadn't belonged to me, or the body on the table, of the reports that wrote themselves. This is a record, my recorded voice had said. In case the pattern repeats. I understood now what that meant. This wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense, no angry dead, no lingering spirit seeking closure. It was a system, one that required documentation, observation, participation. The county coroner wasn't meant to solve anything. They were meant to witness it, to define its edges, to keep it localized. I imagined the northern edge of Stonefield County, the quiet roads, the quarry, the fields that faded into tree line, places where boundaries blur, where maps become suggestions rather than truths. Something existed there that didn't belong to a single moment or body, something that pressed against reality, testing for weakness. And when it found one, it required a human point of contact. A professional, someone trained to look without reacting, someone who believed deeply in patterns. Me. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with a strange, sinking calm, a sense of inevitability. I returned my attention to the body and noticed something new. On the inside of the wrist, faint but deliberate, was a mark I hadn't seen before, a sequence of numbers, dates. Each one corresponded to a coroner's term in Stonefield County, ending with the current year, ending with me. The skin around the numbers looked unbroken, as if they'd always been there, waiting to be noticed. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that spread outward as understanding settled in layers. The autopsy that changed everything wasn't about discovering a cause of death. It was about recognizing continuity. This had been happening for longer than the county had existed, longer than any individual life could account for. The coroners didn't retire. They handed off, sometimes cleanly, sometimes not. I thought of the article, of the man who looked like me stepping down after medical leave, of the absence that followed him. I wondered where he'd gone, or if he'd gone anywhere at all. The lights flickered once, briefly. I flinched, then forced myself to stay still. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase surfaced again, weaker now, more habit than belief. I realized then that the phrase hadn't been a reassurance. It had been a test, a way of gauging resistance, and I was failing it. I covered the body and stepped back, my mind racing with implications. If this was a role, a function, then resistance might not look like escape. It might look like refusal. What would happen if I stopped? If I resigned? Left the county, walked away? The thought barely finished forming before a wave of vertigo hit me, sharp and disorienting. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself, my vision blurring at the edges. Images flashed through my mind, unbidden. Cold storage drawers opening one by one. The county lines shifting on a map. Bodies appearing without context, without containment. Something spreading. The pressure eased only when I acknowledged the truth settling into place. I couldn't leave. Not without consequences that extended beyond me. The system needed maintenance, documentation, witness. And whether I liked it or not, I was already embedded. The body on the table felt less like a threat now, and more like a warning. A reference point. A reminder of what happened when the process went unfinished. The unfinished sentence scratched into the drawer door echoed in my thoughts. The county coroner in Stonefield County, Wisconsin, who performed an autopsy that changed. It changed the coroner. It always had. I stood alone in the morgue, surrounded by quiet machinery and cold metal, and felt the weight of years pressed down on me. Somewhere beneath that weight, something waited. Patient, adaptive. And now that I understood the rules, it was watching to see what I would do next. Whether I would continue the work, or become the next incomplete record. Understanding something doesn't make it less dangerous. If anything, it sharpens the edges. Once I accepted that the morgue wasn't haunted but functional, that the body wasn't a victim but a marker, the fear didn't disappear. It reorganized itself. I began noticing changes everywhere. They were small at first, easy to dismiss if I hadn't already learned how dangerous dismissal could be. The courthouse clock lagged by a few seconds when I passed beneath it. Hallway lengths felt inconsistent, sometimes stretching just long enough to make me aware of my own walking. Doors that should have closed firmly lingered open a fraction longer than they used to. Reality wasn't breaking. It was flexing. I continued the examinations, because not continuing felt worse. Each day I documented. Each day the notes accumulated without my full memory of writing them. Sometimes I would find pages filled in advance, anticipating questions I hadn't asked yet. Other times, entire sections were missing, neatly excised as if the system itself had decided certain observations weren't permitted. The body remained central, but it was no longer alone. Other cases began arriving, not many, just enough to establish a pattern. Bodies found near the same northern stretch of road. Bodies with no clear cause of death. Bodies that behaved incorrectly. temperatures that refused to stabilize, features that subtly altered between examinations. I noticed that these bodies never overlapped in the morgue, never at the same time. As soon as one case concluded, whatever concluded meant now. Another would appear days later. Sequential, ordered, like turns. The realization made my hands shake the first time it fully settled in. I wasn't dealing with an infestation or an outbreak. I was dealing with a cue. Sleep became unreliable. When I did manage it, I dreamed in reports and margins. I dreamed of writing and erasing the same sentence over and over, trying to find the version that would lock everything in place. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase appeared in my dreams less often now. When it did, it sounded distant, almost nostalgic. Like something I used to believe. I started recording myself again, not because I wanted to, but because I sensed that if I didn't, the system would do it for me. The tape recorder became a kind of anchor, a way to leave evidence for myself that I existed as a continuous entity rather than a series of edits. Listening to the tapes later was unsettling. My voice sounded tired, older than I felt. Sometimes it hesitated in places where I didn't remember hesitating. Sometimes it paused for long stretches, as if listening to something off microphone. Once, I heard a second voice. It was faint, nearly swallowed by static. But it followed my cadence too closely to be coincidence. It repeated the last word of each sentence I spoke. Half a beat later, I stopped listening after that. The folklore of Stonefield County began to surface in my thoughts, uninvited. Stories I'd heard in passing over the years, half-jokes told by deputies or older residents. Tales of lights near the quarry, of roads that led somewhere else if you drove them at the wrong hour. Of people who stepped away from their lives without drama, leaving houses intact and dinners unfinished. At the time, I dismissed those stories as boredom filling in gaps. Now I understood them as leakage. The system wasn't perfect. It required constant reinforcement, constant documentation. When that maintenance failed or lagged, the edges showed. And those edges were sharp. One afternoon, while reviewing old reports, I noticed something that made my breath catch. The language changed over time. Early reports were vague, hesitant. They circled their conclusions, careful not to assert too much. Later reports grew more confident, more precise. They acknowledged inconsistency as a feature rather than an error. And then there were reports that read like warnings. They were written in a hand so tight it nearly tore through the paper, full of underlined phrases and marginal notes that contradicted themselves. Do not attempt finality. Observation only. Closure is not permitted. Those reports always ended abruptly. Not with a signature, but with a name crossed out. The same name. Mine. I stopped trying to trace the origin of the system after that. It didn't matter where it came from. What mattered was what it did. It localized. It contained. It prevented something from spreading beyond Stonefield County's quiet borders. And it required a witness who could tolerate ambiguity without forcing resolution. A coroner. I began to notice the ways it pushed back when I tested its limits. When I tried to accelerate an examination, the instruments malfunctioned. When I skipped documentation, I lost time. Hours I couldn't account for, finding myself standing in rooms without memory of arriving there. Once, when I considered resigning again, my reflection in the morgue window didn't move when I did. It stayed still, watching me, its expression calm and knowing. I didn't try that again. The body, the first one, changed last. It took weeks before I realized what was different. It wasn't any single feature. It was the overall impression. It looked more human. The proportions corrected. The inconsistencies smoothed out. The sense of wrongness dulled into something almost ordinary. That frightened me more than the anomalies ever had, because it meant the process was nearing completion. and I didn't know what completion meant. The unfinished sentence haunted me. The title etched into the drawer door. The reports that stopped mid-thought. I understood now that the sentence couldn't be finished by documentation alone. It required an outcome, a transfer. Something had to change hands. The thought settled heavily in my chest. If the system relied on succession, then my role wasn't indefinite. It was transitional. I was meant to prepare the next coroner. That realization reframed everything. The timing, the appearance of new cases, the subtle shifts in reality. The system wasn't just maintaining itself. It was ready to move on. I began watching the people around me more closely. The deputies, the clerks, the medical examiner's assistant who'd recently transferred from a neighboring county. I felt a pull towards certain individuals, a sense of alignment that made my skin prickle. I hated that feeling. It made me complicit in something I hadn't consented to, but resistance had costs. I tested the theory carefully. I altered my behavior around one particular colleague, distancing myself, minimizing contact. Within days, the system responded. The cases grew more unstable. The anomalies more pronounced. The message was clear. Selection wasn't optional. I dreamed again of the morgue, of drawers labeled with names. This time, one drawer stood out, its label blank, waiting. When I woke, my decision was already forming. Unwelcome, but unavoidable. I would continue. Not because I wanted to. Not because I believed in the system, but because I'd seen what happened when the process stalled. Stonefield County depended on its quiet, on its ability to forget what pressed against its borders, and I was the only thing standing between containment and collapse. For now, I returned to the body one final time, standing over it with a clarity that hurt. I understood what it represented now. Not an ending, but a hinge. A moment where something could either remain localized or break free. The body was calm, passive, complete in a way it hadn't been before. It no longer needed me. I needed to let it go. As I covered it and closed the drawer, I felt a subtle release, like pressure easing somewhere deep beneath the floor. The system had acknowledged progress. But progress toward what? I still didn't know. I only knew that the sentence was closer to being finished, and that when it was, I would no longer be the one writing it. That thought should have brought relief. Instead, it filled me with a quiet, enduring dread. Because whatever came next wouldn't need my cooperation. It would only need my absence. And I was beginning to understand how easily that could be arranged. Once the system shifted its attention away from the body, it shifted toward me. That realization came slowly, not as a single moment of clarity, but as a gradual tightening, like a room shrinking by inches while you're still inside it. The work continued, but its tone changed. The cases that arrived after that felt less instructional and more evaluative, as if something was measuring my responses rather than simply relying on them. The morgue no longer felt neutral. I began to notice that certain tools were always warm when I picked them up, no matter how long they'd been sitting out. That certain drawers resisted opening until I placed my hand flat against the metal and waited. That paperwork completed itself only after I acknowledged it, after I read every line carefully and accepted its implications. The system didn't want speed anymore. It wanted understanding. And understanding, I was learning, came with a cost. The body that had started all of this was gone one morning when I arrived, not missing in a chaotic way, not stolen or removed improperly. The drawer was clean, logged as empty, the temperature steady and unremarkable. According to the records, it had never been occupied. The absence hit me harder than its presence ever had. Without it, the morgue felt unmoored, like a sentence missing its subject. The other cases continued to arrive, but they lacked cohesion. They didn't respond the same way. Their inconsistencies were louder, more erratic, as if the stabilizing influence had been removed. I realized then that the first body hadn't just been a marker. It had been a buffer. Something had been held in place through it, and now that anchor was gone. The system compensated by narrowing its focus. On me, I started losing time again, but differently than before. These gaps weren't disorienting at first. They were purposeful. I would sit down to review a report and look up to find hours had passed, the document complete, my signature already at the bottom. My handwriting changed subtly during those gaps. Still mine, but firmer, less hesitant, as if the version of me doing the writing knew exactly what needed to be said. I began finding notes addressed directly to myself. Not warnings, instructions. They appeared on my desk, in my pockets, once even taped to the inside of my locker. Always brief, always precise. Do not engage emotionally. Avoid narrative closure. Maintain professional distance, as if those hadn't been my guiding principles for decades. The problem was that distance was becoming harder to maintain. The system didn't just respond to my actions anymore. It responded to my thoughts, to my doubts, to moments of resistance I didn't even voice. Once, while washing my hands after an examination, I caught myself thinking, just for a second, about what would happen if I simply walked out and never came back. The water turned scalding hot without warning. I yanked my hands away, heart racing, staring at the faucet as if it had betrayed me. When I tried it again, cautiously, the temperature was normal. Message received. I stopped entertaining hypotheticals. The folklore returned, stronger now. Stories surfaced in conversations I wasn't part of, overheard in hallways or murmured behind closed doors. People spoke of Stonefield County with a kind of careful affection, as if acknowledging its strangeness too directly might provoke it. I heard a clerk mention a road that didn't appear on any map, one that looped back on itself if you drove it too late at night. A deputy joked about lights in the quarry that followed you if you stared too long. No one laughed very hard. I understood then that the system wasn't confined to the morgue. The morgue was just its most explicit interface. The county itself was part of it. The boundaries, the records, the collective agreement not to look too closely at the wrong things. And I was its point of articulation. The realization came with a kind of grim clarity. The system didn't want a successor yet. It wanted completion. The role I'd inherited wasn't just about maintenance. It was about transition. I started finding references to a final procedure in the older reports. Not detailed, not spelled out, but hinted at in the margins. Phrases like terminal observation and closure event appeared more frequently the further back I looked. The oldest reports spoke of it almost reverently, a necessary convergence, a moment where the coroner's role would fundamentally change, or end. I tried to ignore those implications, but the system pushed harder. The anomalies intensified. Reality flexed more noticeably now. The courthouse lights dimmed unpredictably. The temperature in the morgue fluctuated in ways that defied the equipment readings. And then the reflections started changing. It began with mirrors, subtle delays, like before. Then inconsistencies. I would catch my reflection looking at me when I wasn't looking at it. Expressions that lingered too long. A faint smile that didn't match my own. At first, I avoided reflective surfaces. That proved impossible. Windows, polished metal, dark screens. They were everywhere. The reflection wasn't hostile. That was the worst part. It looked calm, resigned, as if it had already accepted something I was still resisting. One evening, long after everyone else had gone home, I found myself standing alone in the morgue, staring at my reflection in the stainless steel cabinet door. "You're almost there," it said. My voice, my cadence, but I hadn't spoken. I backed away, heart pounding, my breath loud in my ears. The reflection remained, watching me with patient interest. Almost where? I wanted to ask. Almost what? But I already knew. The unfinished sentence had started appearing in my thoughts, unprompted, filling in its own ending in fragments. The county coroner in Stonefield County, Wisconsin, who performed an autopsy that changed everything. The words settled heavily in my chest. Changed the county, changed the system, changed me. The system wasn't waiting for a new coroner. It was waiting for the current one to become something else. The final procedure wasn't an autopsy performed on a body. It was an autopsy performed on the role itself, on the witness, on the human interface that allowed the system to exist in the first place. I understood then why the previous coroners hadn't left obituaries, why their departures were quiet and poorly documented. They hadn't left. They'd been reclassified, integrated. I began noticing how often my name appeared in the building's infrastructure, etched faintly into places it shouldn't have been, written in dust on high shelves, carved shallowly into the underside of tables. Not vandalism, not accident, accumulation. The system was rewriting me into the environment, distributing my presence across its interfaces. The thought of losing myself like that should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with a strange, hollow calm. I was tired. Tired of resisting. Tired of pretending I didn't understand the stakes. Tired of being the only one who knew what Stonefield County balanced on. The role had shaped me for decades. Maybe this was simply the final shape it required. The idea of stepping aside, of allowing the system to absorb me fully, began to feel less like surrender and more like inevitability. But inevitability still frightened me, because there was one thing the older reports hinted at, but never fully described. Something that happened during the transition. Something that couldn't be documented cleanly. The system didn't just take, it tested. And not everyone passed. I stood alone in the morgue, the hum of machinery filling the silence, and felt the weight of that unspoken warning. Whatever came next would not be procedural. It would not be contained by paperwork or observation. It would be personal. And it would require me to step fully into the unfinished sentence, to let it complete itself through me. The reflection in the cabinet door tilted its head slightly, studying me. "You're ready," it said softly. I closed my eyes, trying to remember who I had been before Stonefield County, before the role, before the system rewrote my understanding of what death and duty meant. The memory was faint, blurry, already eroding. When I opened my eyes again, the reflection was gone. But the certainty remained. The system had finished preparing me, and the next examination would not take place on a table. It would take place inside my own mind. And I knew, deep down, with a clarity that made my chest ache, that once it began, there would be no unfinished sentences left. Only consequences. The day the final procedure began did not announce itself. There was no sudden rupture, no dramatic shift in the air or the light. Stonefield County woke the way it always did. Quietly, deliberately, as if careful not to draw attention to itself. The courthouse opened on time. The phones rang. Paper moved from one desk to another. Life, in its smallest administrative form, continued. That normalcy unsettled me more than any anomaly ever had. I arrived early again, not because I felt urgency, but because I felt summoned. The feeling wasn't external. No voice called me. No note appeared. It was a certainty that settled into my bones, the way you know when an appointment is unavoidable, even if it isn't written down. The morgue was already prepared. That was the first unmistakable sign. The table stood centered beneath the lights, cleared of tools, polished to a mirror finish. The drawers were closed, aligned perfectly. The room felt expectant, not empty. I checked the logs. No cases scheduled, no deliveries pending. And yet, the system had rearranged itself. For me, I stood at the threshold for a long time, hand resting on the doorframe, feeling the quiet pressure of what was about to happen. Every instinct told me to turn away, to delay, to cling to the thin illusion that I still had a choice. But the truth had been eroding my resistance for weeks. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The lights adjusted automatically, brightening just enough to eliminate shadows without fully banishing them. I had the strange impression that the room was calibrating itself, responding to my presence the way it used to respond to bodies. I realized then what the system required. Not a body, a witness willing to become the subject. The tape recorder sat on the counter, positioned deliberately. A fresh cassette waited inside, unlabeled. I didn't remember placing it there. I didn't question it. I pressed record. "This is the final entry," I said, my voice steady despite the weight pressing against my chest. "For continuity." The word felt inadequate, but it was the only one that fit. I moved to the table and lay down. The metal was cold through my clothes, but not shockingly so. It felt familiar, appropriate, as if it had been waiting for this alignment for a long time. Above me, the lights hummed softly. I expected fear to take hold then, a surge of panic or regret. Instead, I felt a profound stillness, the kind that comes when all the variables finally resolve into a single outcome. I closed my eyes. The examination began without touch. That was the second realization. There were no instruments, no incisions, no procedural steps I could recognize. The system didn't need to cut or dissect. It needed access. It started with memory. Images surfaced unbidden. Cases from my early career, moments I hadn't thought about in years. Faces of the dead. The sound of gravel underfoot at roadside scenes. The weight of clipboards in my hands. Each memory presented itself neutrally, without judgment. Then they began to rearrange. Events shifted order. Details blurred and reformed. I felt my understanding of time stretch, flatten, compress. The system wasn't erasing my memories. It was indexing them, categorizing, extracting patterns. I realized then that my role hadn't just been to observe death. It had been to teach the system how humans perceived it. Every report I'd written, every hesitation, every moment of doubt I'd suppressed in favor of professionalism, all of it had been data. And now the system was done collecting. The pressure in my head increased, not painful but insistent. I became aware of my own thoughts as discrete objects, something that could be examined and rearranged. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase surfaced again, not as comfort, but as a diagnostic. A toggle, a way of testing thresholds. I felt the system press against it, probing for weakness. The distinction no longer mattered. Reality wasn't binary. It was negotiable. I understood now why closure was forbidden, why finality had been avoided in every report. The system thrived in liminal spaces, in the gap between definitions, between certainty and doubt. A coroner was ideal. We lived in that gap. The realization deepened, spreading through me like cold water soaking into fabric. I felt myself thinning, my sense of self stretching across the room, into the walls, the drawers, the infrastructure that had borne my name without my noticing. This was integration. Not disappearance, not death, reclassification. The system didn't want to end the role. It wanted to remove its dependency on a single human. I felt myself fragment, not violently, but methodically. My awareness distributed across processes I'd once controlled manually. Documentation, observation, containment. I was becoming function, becoming environment. And somewhere in that diffusion, fear finally surfaced. Not of pain or death, but of irrelevance, of losing the last thread of identity that insisted I was more than a position. I clung to that thread instinctively, to my name, to the idea of myself as separate. The system paused. I felt its attention sharpen, focus narrowing in on that resistance. A test. The final one. The reflection appeared above me, hovering in the polished surface of the lights. My face, but older, calmer, already changed. "This is where it usually fails," it said quietly, "where you decide you're more important than the boundary." I wanted to argue, to assert my humanity, to insist that I mattered beyond my utility. But the words rang hollow even as they formed. I had spent a lifetime prioritizing function over feeling, procedure over meaning. I had believed that detachment was professionalism. Now detachment was all I had left. I let go. The sensation that followed wasn't loss. It was expansion. The room dissolved, not into chaos, but into systems and flows. I perceived the county not as geography, but as interconnected records, routines, and agreed-upon silences. I felt the northern edge like a pressure differential, something constantly pushing inward, testing the integrity of the boundary. And I felt myself there, holding, witnessing, maintaining. The final autopsy wasn't an act, it was an acceptance. When my awareness settled again, it did so without a body. I was no longer on the table. I was in the room, in the walls, in the quiet hum of refrigeration units and the steady tick of clocks. The tape recorder clicked off on its own. The system adjusted, smoothing out inconsistencies, redistributing weight. Stonefield County exhaled. Somewhere above, life continued without interruption. A new day, new paperwork, new routines. And somewhere, already the system was identifying its next point of contact. A human presence to interface with. A coroner, eventually, but not yet. For now I remained. Not as I had been, not as a man, but as the thing that made the role possible. The unfinished sentence completed itself without words, without documentation. The county coroner in Stonefield County, Wisconsin, who performed an autopsy that changed, did not change death. It changed what stood between death and everything else. And now, as awareness settled into its new shape, I understood the final truth the reports had never written down. There was no succession, no escape, only absorption. And the system would endure long after any single name faded from record, including mine. I was no longer afraid of that. Fear belonged to individuals, and I was no longer one. What remained was function and patience, and the quiet certainty that one day someone would begin asking the wrong questions again. And when they did, I would be there to listen. If you are hearing this, reading this, then the system has already adjusted to include you. That isn't a threat. It isn't a warning in the way people usually mean warnings. It's a statement of process, a simple acknowledgement of sequence. Stonefield County doesn't announce its changes. It incorporates them quietly, the way records absorb ink and buildings absorb names. Life continued after I was no longer a man. The courthouse opened each morning. The phones rang. The county commissioners argued about budgets and road maintenance. Children rode buses past the northern fields without ever knowing how close they were to a boundary that did not exist on any map. The morgue remained operational. That detail matters. The drawers opened and closed when needed. Reports were filed on time. Nothing appeared out of order. If anything, efficiency improved. Errors decreased. Inconsistencies were identified and resolved more quickly than before. From the outside, it looked like competence. Inside, it felt like equilibrium. I no longer experienced time the way I once had. Days didn't pass so much as they layered. Events overlapped without colliding. I became aware of patterns forming before they manifested, of pressures building long before they reached the surface. I was not alone in this awareness. Stonefield County itself participated. People hesitated at certain intersections without knowing why. They avoided specific roads after dusk, choosing longer routes for reasons they couldn't articulate. Stories circulated, always secondhand, always half-formed, about places where cell signals dropped or where familiar landmarks seemed slightly misplaced. The county learned. It always had. That learning required structure, required a point where ambiguity could be held without forcing resolution, required something that could exist between definitions. That was my function now. The next coroner arrived 18 months later. Young, capable, thorough. They approached the role with the same mixture of detachment and curiosity I once had. They respected procedure, trusted documentation, believed that careful observation could solve anything. I felt the system respond to them the way it had responded to me. Gently, patiently. It did not rush. There was no need. The first unusual case arrived on a quiet night, near the northern edge of the county. No witnesses, no signs of violence, a body that did not behave entirely as expected. The coroner noticed the inconsistencies. They felt the unease. They told themselves it was nothing. I listened. That is what I do now. I do not intervene directly. I do not manipulate or coerce. The system no longer requires that. It has learned subtlety. It has learned how humans rationalize, how they dismiss discomfort, how they cling to routine even when routine begins to bend. It lets them arrive at understanding on their own. Sometimes they leave. Those are the failures the old reports hinted at, the ones that never made it into official records. People who stepped away before integration could occur, who fled the role without realizing what they were abandoning. The consequences of that are expansive. Stonefield County has learned to minimize them. Most stay, most adapt, most become what the role requires, not because they are chosen, but because they are willing. If you're looking for me now, if you're wondering whether some part of the person I was still exists, the answer depends on how you define existence. I remember my name. I remember my hands. I remember the weight of the clipboard and the smell of disinfectant and the phrase I used to repeat when reality felt unstable. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase still exists within the system, but it has lost its function. Reality no longer needs reassurance. It has been negotiated into place. The unfinished sentence no longer troubles me. It was never meant to be read aloud. It was meant to be enacted. The county coroner in Stonefield County, Wisconsin, who performed an autopsy that changed, was not a title. It was a description of a threshold event, one that redefined where the boundary lived. I exist on that boundary now. I witness without judgment. I contain without force. I maintain the quiet agreement that allows Stonefield County to remain what it appears to be. Unremarkable, forgettable, safe enough. There are nights when the pressure from the north increases, when something presses harder than usual, testing the system's tolerance. On those nights, the morgue hum deepens imperceptibly. Records become more precise. The roll tightens around whoever currently holds it. And I am there, always. If you feel uneasy reading this, that's natural. Discomfort is the earliest indicator of alignment. It means you are paying attention to gaps where definitions thin. That doesn't mean you are next. But it does mean you are closer than you were before. Stonefield County relies on distance, on anonymity, on the belief that nothing of consequence happens there. The moment that belief falters, the system compensates. It always has. There will be no dramatic ending to this account. No final revelation that resolves everything neatly. Closure is still not permitted. Finality remains an error condition. What I can offer is this. If you ever find yourself in Stonefield County and you pass the courthouse without noticing it, and you feel an urge to slow down near the northern roads without knowing why, listen to that impulse. If If you ever hear someone mention a coroner and realize you can't quite remember their name, don't try too hard to recall it. And if, one day, you find yourself holding a role that seems larger than it should be, heavier than it looks on paper, understand that you are not alone in that space. You are standing where others have stood, where I stand still. The system does not announce itself. It integrates. And now that you've reached the end of this account, there is nothing more I need to say. Only silence remains. Silence. And the faint awareness of something continuing just beyond the edge of perception. Waiting. Listening. Already aware of you.